Hello, I'm Susan Whitlow from Learning Resource Services here at UCSF. I'd like to talk today about effective and efficient learning strategies while you're a student here in the School of Medicine. There's quite a bit that we've learned in recent years from cognitive psychology about what is a really effective way to put information in our long-term memory and then also have it available to us for lifelong learning, for lifelong experiences where we're going to need to do that. I'd like you to think for a moment before we launch into this is you've all taken tests. Would you like to have more tests? Maybe make a note of that on a piece of scratch paper. We'll go on here in a moment and we'll come back to that question at the end of the presentation. So what you may have done as an undergraduate got you here to UCSF. You've been a very successful student until this point. However, the type of curriculum, the volume and the complexity and the rate at which you'll have to take it in jumps up almost exponentially. So how can we get you then to think about what's going to help you be the most excellent clinician you can become, which ought to be your long-term goal. It's not just to perform well on tests, but to have this information. One of the things the School of Medicine is going to do is they're going to ask you to think about learning being a spiral. That you're going to get some information here in your first months of medical school, but that's not the only path that you're going to get on this material. You're going to have to go back and each next coursework, you're going to then touch on some of that material again. And so you will get it in other courses. They'll talk about similar concepts, maybe from a different point of view. And then you will also get some of this material when you're out in your clerkships and then beyond in internship and residency. What you really want to do here is build a robust memory network. And you want to build a multitude of robust memory networks. And so we're going to talk about some techniques today that how you can begin to build those networks. So let's go back and think about some early cognitive psychology. And I'm going to take you back to the 1870s, and a fellow named Herman Ebbinghaus was a philosophy student, and he was trying to figure out a way to put some mathematical precision on psychology, which was part of the field of philosophy at that point. And so what he did is he started to look at memory issues, and he needed to make it simple, as we do in research, so that it would be easy to measure. So he practiced memorizing nonsense syllables, things like yub or zek or gelk. Didn't have any meaning, didn't connect with any real word. And he would memorize a list of those, like say 50 of them, and then he would test himself on it. Well, as you can see from this curve, right after he had studied them, he was able to be at about 100%. But that rapidly faded. And so by even 20 minutes in, he only retained about 60% of that. And an hour in, he was below 50%. And at 9 hours after he had studied it, he was down somewhere around 30%. And then that flattened out. And that stayed pretty flat for days on. I mean, if he went and tested himself after a month, he would remember some of it, but really we're talking about 20%. Well, that's not really adequate to the kinds of learning you're going to need to do now or in your future. So what can we do to kind of push that curve up? Probably the most effective strategy you could use to get that curve pushed back up is what we'd call spaced retrieval. And it can change the forgetting curve. So you're not like doomed to have this like 20%, you've studied something very hard and you've only got a 20% retention of it. So the first time you study it, you're going to be at 100%. And then it's going to start to fade. And then the next time you go back to review it, that may be like that you're reviewing your notes, you may listen to another lecture on it, you may do another activity in your coursework that will push that back up. And you may be again at 100%, and that will also begin to drop down as we come down here. Now, this curve, one of the drawbacks of this is it shows that you're going to go through it 4 times. Now, the likelihood that you're going to be able to cover all your material 4 times before an exam here is not all that reasonable, and we don't really expect that you'll do that. But that each time you do it, you're pushing that forgetting curve so that you're staying around that 90% retention rate, which is a much better way to go. I think then the question here is that this shows that in terms of days that you might go along, and often you're moving so quickly in our curriculum that it's not like you have, oh, well, I'll space this out and go back and do my review in 7 days. I think if you have, like, say, a week until when you're going to be tested on the material, you want a couple of days in between that. If you're so far ahead, you're doing, say, you're studying a month in, then you might want to have it be about a week in between that. You want some of that forgetting to happen, because when you have to dig in and really pull that information out, you're making it a much stronger pathway to retrieve the information. Another technique that is very helpful for long-term retention is called interleaving. I'm going to talk about interleaving versus what we might call massed practice or cramming. So often, as undergraduates, the curriculum lends itself such that you could cram for a test, do very well on the test, and then a day or so later, you would have forgotten that. So you may have studied for like a night or two right before the test, really crammed that information, really had it down. But that information then is not so available to you a week or a month or 6 months later. So alternately, I would suggest that you think about what we would call interleaving and spacing out that material. One of the wonderful things, again, about the School of Medicine is they've put this in by design to your curriculum. And they're going to give you information in a multitude of ways. They may have it as a lecture. They may have it as a video, kind of like this. You may go to lab. You may work with a small group. Or you may just hear like a speaker come in to do a single lecture. And so through that, they're going to have these different ways of having the interleaving going on. But knowing what they're doing, that they're trying to help you with that, I think is a good way to be aware, and how you can then break up your own studying so you're not saying, I'm going to go home and just do anatomy tonight. If you can kind of mix that up, you're going to have much better retention of that information, which will save you more review down the road. At the beginning, I asked you about if you'd like more tests. If I had called it retrieval practice, that may have been a more acceptable term, and they really are the same thing. So testing, self-testing, retrieval practice. And it's not just the formal testing that you have like on an exam day or a midterm or a final or on some kind of high stakes test. It's ways that you can begin to build this in to your own studying. The School of Medicine builds this into your curriculum in some really nice ways. They will give you each week some open-ended questions and some multiple choice questions in your weekly checkpoints to do. And rather than wait until a midterm, you've got some time to practice that and practice retrieving that information and see where you are, and so assess, are you going to need to go and do some more studying on that material, or have you pretty much mastered that and you can move on to some new material? There's a study, there have been a number of studies, but this particular study done by two cognitive psychologists at Washington University, St. Louis, have shown some value of testing over just studying. And so in this particular study, they got a group of undergraduates, probably taking an intro to psych class, and what they did is they were broken into two groups. And they were then given some passages, scientifically based, like about the sun and about some sea otters. They're about maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs long, so not a huge amount of material, but some. And the first group here, with this, they were told that they were able to study it for 7 minutes. They took a break where they did some like what we would call interference tasks. I think they were doing multiplication problems. And then they came back and they had another 7-minute period to study the material. The second group, the study group, they studied it for 7 minutes, they did the interference task, and then they came back and they did the test. And the test was just write down everything you remember, all the facts you can recall from this article on either the sun or sea otters. And so then both groups then took the post-test, which was, again, write down everything you remember. So in the initial moments here, the group that had the studied it and they saw the material for longer, they were better. Their recall was better. But that really was sort of an illusion, because they felt fluent, and we've all done that before. We've studied material, and that night we think, I've got this, and it really isn't as solid as we'd like it to be in our brains. So the group that had it longer in the immediate time did better than the group here that had to take the test and had their study time shortened. But 2 days out, the group that had taken the test did significantly better than the group that had just done the 2 study periods. And a week this held up. And other studies have shown this going out, that the testing is actually a more effective way of putting that and consolidating it into long-term memory. So this is some of the underlying theory of how we learn and how our brain works to try and retain information for the long term and consolidate it in our long-term memory and then be available when we need to draw on that down the road. In the next section, what I'd like to do then is talk about some specific strategies about how you would then be able to put those into work for you as a medical student here at the University of California, San Francisco.